Hello, welcome to PSR, People Speaking Rail, and we have a fun one today. What I thought would be a good way to end the year with People Speaking Rail is to talk through the John Oliver show from about a week and a half ago and talk about what we thought John Oliver got right and wrong. If you haven't seen it, it's on HBO Max. About 25 minutes, very humorous, goes through a bunch of critiques of the railroad industry. Very worthwhile. I'm Mike Baudendistel, joined by Joanna Marsh. Joanna, did you have a chance to see the show?
I did. Well, so I don't have HBO Max, so I had to, but it is actually on YouTube, or even if you do, I think a search for, you know, John Oliver and trains, it'll pop up. So I don't know how long the link is going to be there, or if it just kind of stays there forever. But but you can definitely catch it now while it's still there for sure. So.
Yeah, I would say check that out. And before we talk about that show, I just want to make sure everyone knows how to sign up for the FreightWaves Railroad newsletter. All you have to do is go to www.freightwaves.com/subscribe. And you subscribe to any of our newsletters. You scroll down to the bottom, and the second one from the bottom is that Rail newsletter. Will be in your inbox every Thursday. Clearly, John Oliver's writing staff is subscribed to this. They showed one of Rachel Premack's articles. So on to the critique. So we're going to critique John Oliver's critique. And my scorecard, I have three items that I thought were fair. Critiques of the railroads. One of them was multi-part, so it's really more than three. And then the ones I thought were unfair, I have six where either I thought maybe the critique was unfair or maybe there was some lacking context. So we can go through that. I think one of the things I thought was unfair, so first item here is they didn't say a word about positive train control, which since this was such a focused thing on the railroad safety issues, that one line about positive train control maybe would have been prudent, given that that was a multi-billion-dollar mandate, unfunded mandate that was required by Congress as a result of the Chatsworth, California derailment in 2008, and for all the discussion of the issues with railroad safety, not mentioning what I would argue is basically the worst train derailment of all time, not being mentioned. It was, relatively long time ago, 2008, but thought that, positive train control really has made the industry safer, since that's designed to eliminate, human errors. So that was kind of item number one that I thought was, unfair. Or maybe we should go through the fair ones first. So maybe we'll go back and forth. So that was an unfair one. I thought they should have mentioned positive train control. One that I thought was fair was that the discussion of the rank and file workers, so these union members not being able to ask the FRA questions without retaliation from, in the case of the example they made was a BNSF manager came down on a railroad worker for asking the FRA a question. And to me, I mean, that doesn't make any sense. That is, sort of an abusive, toxic culture. I mean, anyone should be able to ask the FRA a question, whether that be a railroad worker, member of the public, shipper, what have you. So I thought that was fair. I mean, do understand at a high level why BNSF would not want a union member to go to them. It's a little bit like, asking the IRS, I have this offshore account that's not tied to my social security number. Am I allowed to do that? It might end up auditing that person. So it's kind of like tipping the FRA that, maybe this is something to be audited, and maybe tipping them off that something is illegal. But still, if everything's on the up and up, railroad should say, go ask the FRA all the questions you want. Another issue that I thought was, a fair criticism of the railroads was some of the communities impact with the very long railroads. The passing sidings, I think in a lot of cases do need to be extended. That's commensurate with the increased lengths of the trains. And it is problematic when you have certain communities. I mean, there's some communities that the only way to get in and out of them is crossing one railroad track. And like there was that one community in Texas that there was an article that was described that really well. I can't remember where exactly that was in, but the first responders couldn't get in because it was blocked by the railroad crossing. And it does encourage students and members of the public to just sort of walk through there. So something has to be done where, if a railroad is going to deploy a very long train, through a community, that needs to be taken into consideration. Just how that impacts being able to cross, and all those related safety issues. And there was that section in the video talking about the railroad's priorities under positive train, or under PTC, under PSR, and showed safety being the fourth priority. And it's almost like you could sort of make that same prioritization in terms of the constituencies of the railroads, where really I would argue this constituencies prioritization of the railroads is shareholders number one, maybe customers number two, maybe a distant number two over the last several years, and then unions and the communities are kind of maybe that fourth prioritization. So I think they need to be bumped up. So so that's, I think, another sort of fair criticism for the most part. Even though I recognize that in certain cases, maybe the roads can't extend the passing sidings, but in some cases, maybe they should deploy shorter trains if it's going to go through urban areas like that. The other one that I thought was fair was the FRA. Maybe the FRA should have more power over the railroads, and maybe the railroads shouldn't self-regulate to the extent that they do. I mean, the criticism that the rail cars that were maybe involved in the East Palestine derailment weren't inspected for very long. They only have a minute and a half or 30 seconds in some cases to inspect the rail cars. Maybe there should be some regulations there. I think a lot of those things are coming, which was maybe one of the things that was less fair. And then there's all these related issues with, the FRA not knowing where the trains are, or maybe the issue is not knowing what cargo is in the rail cars. And I would sort of split that hair by saying, yes, I think the FRA should know what's in a particular rail car, but I think the individuals who do that need to have a very high clearance, basically security clearance, because I don't think it should be a matter of public record to know where there's hazardous materials on a train. I think that just opens up too much potential for terrorism and foul play. So, Joanna, what did you think about those topics?
Yeah, I mean, I guess to kick off, like in general, I do appreciate how how John Oliver was prefaced his critique of the industry by saying that that he supports the railroads, and that he supports what they do, and that it's not necessarily something that let's ban railroads. So I do appreciate that he bookended the segment with excuse me, both that that sentiment before he kicked off, and then at the very end. So that is to start off with that. The one, I guess the one of the main things that struck me was, well, okay, on one hand, it was I felt it, it was kind of a good overview of things for the most part. But one thing that struck me is, and maybe it's an interest of time or whatever, but you talked about the Federal Railroad Administration, and how it might need to do more to regulate the railroads. But there was no mention of the Surface Transportation Board, which sort of looks at the economics of things, and so how the railroads deal with shippers, if there are any sort of rail rates and stuff like that, and even though it's two different buckets of two different silos. You have safety and you have like economics, especially under PSR. Those silos have kind of become more, I would say, intertwined, but they're not so separate. Like you see, with the question about workforce, if workforce was cut as a way to cut costs, if workforce levels were a way to cut costs, like how does that impact safety, for instance? And so you have these economic decisions that might have safety implications. And so I think just in general, some of these the safety issues, kind of like the sidings, for instance, that makes sense. But then economically, how can you, is there a way that you can justify that to the railroads, or I
Mhm.
guess that's kind of what I felt was missing. That sort of, it did touch upon like safety and economics, but there was no mention of the STB, which kind of struck me as
Yeah,
interesting.
yeah, and it's not like the STB, which economically regulates the railroads, doesn't care about safety. I mean, that was the big thing that Marty Oberman brought up at Rail Trends, sort of raking Union Pacific over the coals because they furloughed maintenance away workers. He was making the argument those people shouldn't have been furloughed because, let's say, the traffic hasn't declined to a certain amount that you wouldn't need those people, and he was concerned that that would ultimately hurt safety. So the STB does come down on the railroads. I mean, it's not their primary focus; it's more the economics, but they do care about that a lot as well. Some of the other things I have listed as maybe being potentially unfair to the railroads during that piece. The part about the one man crews, where the Class One railroads, now you have to have two people on a crew, locomotive engineer and a conductor on any longer haul train. I think it's a little bit of a straw man argument that the railroads want this to be one man crew, because I think it's very unlikely we're going to see this. I mean, you bring up in your article just published the other day, I guess published yesterday, New York is the latest state to require two-man crews on the freight trains. And this joins a kind of laundry list of other states. Now we're up to 11. Earlier this year was Ohio and Kansas, but now we have a total of 11 that require two-person crew. So in order to go to a one-person crew, not only would the unions have to adjust their rules, which I don't think that's going to happen. I think that's a hill they will die on. You would also have to have some federal law that supersedes the state law. I don't think there's going to be a lot of lawmakers that are going to stand up and say, not in favor of rail safety, you can go to one-man crew. I just don't think that's going to happen. So I thought that was a little bit of a straw man argument. The other one was maybe some of the sick day comments lacked a little bit of context. I think, we've talked about this a lot in the past. Tony Hatch brought it up on our show last week that the sick days was a little bit of a political chip to get more pay, whereas no one was talking about the sick day issue before the negotiations between the railroads and the union workers kind of came to a head, and kind of at the 11th hour, they threw the sick day comments in there. And those sick day rules, they have been a little bit outdated, and they've been updated. And I think John Oliver said it was updated on BNSF, but I was under the impression that all the railroads now have some degree of floating sick days where people could take off if all of a sudden they get sick. And some of those older rules were basically designed, they had like point system to make sure that not everyone takes Super Bowl Sunday off, because the railroads run 24/7, 365. So I thought that was a little bit unfair, at least lacking context. Another issue, keep going here, is on the East Palestine derailment. And yes, that was a huge derailment. Yes, hugely expensive, like he brought up. What they didn't say was that the EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, doesn't say there's an ongoing health risks associated with being in East Palestine, living in East Palestine. So, there wasn't a comment from, the EPA about how, what the situation in there is on the ground, because it really didn't support the thesis that was one of the worst derailments in, history. Didn't mention that no person was killed during that. There were some chickens that didn't make it. I think probably some fish. And, but to me, it was not one of the worst derailments, that we've seen. Nothing like Lac Megantic. I mean, he brings up Lac Megantic, and that was for sure absolutely horrific. And hopefully we'll never see a Lac Megantic again. But some of the East Palestine comments, I thought, lacked the context that the EPA comments would have provided some balance to. And didn't say a word about the Railway Safety Act, which I know you've talked a lot about. What's the status on the Railway Safety Act? We think we probably will see this next year.
Maybe. I mean, I think what's holding some lawmakers back is is waiting for the final report from the National Transportation Safety Board on East Palestine and seeing. Granted, NTSB has been putting out some, not lately, but they had been putting out some recommendations by piecemeal, as the process is ongoing. But I think just kind of waiting for that final report and seeing how it meshes with what's the provisions that are in the Railway Safety Act. So that's what's holding at least some lawmakers back for now.
Yeah, so I think there's going to be new safety regulations that come as a result of the East Palestine derailment. We just haven't gotten there yet. But just like there was, big safety regulation after Chatsworth gave rise to PTC, I think the Railway Safety Act is going to give rise to potentially new rules on things like the spacing of the sensors to see where those wheel bearings get hot. I mean, that seems to be a huge issue related to not just the Norfolk Southern derailment, also one on CSX. So I think some of those safety regulations are coming to address those type of things. And then on the safety comparison, I mean, he did mention that railroads are safer than trucks, but the stats on just how much safer, I mean, you could look at this a lot of different ways. I mean, just sort of one way is just how many people die on highways versus die on the railroad. I mean, sort of in a given year, it's about 39,500 people die on U.S. highways each year, and that's compared to about 950 rail fatalities. And a lot of those rail fatalities are suicides, unfortunately. So you kind of think even if you include the suicides, it's still like deaths on highways are 40x what they are on the railroad. So it's way safer. I mean, it sort of showed that magnitude on the emissions and the carbon impact, but sort of it's also striking just how much safer the railroads are. Did I miss anything with those?
I don't think so. I had a thought pop into my head, but I can't remember it now. But no, I mean I agree. I think I remember my thought now. I'm a little, although this is just my own personal opinion. I, I'm glad you're hopeful about the rail safety bill. I'm kind of a little cynical about Congress in general getting things done. So I actually don't know how much of something will happen. I mean, there might be momentum again for sure after the NTSB report, but in terms of actually getting something through, for better for worse, could it? The odds might be better if something bad happens, which you don't really want to, of course. But but that's just again my personal opinion. But I think in terms of your thoughts about the show, I think I would generally agree. So.
Yeah, and it was really good. I mean, it's all that stuff bringing in the Thomas Tank Engine. Wasn't familiar with those older cartoons. It does have really good writers. Something was lost when all those writers were on strike. Glad that they're back, so we can have things like that to distract us and entertain us. And it is kind of an odd exercise to provide a serious critique to a comedy show, but it's last show of the year and it's holiday season, and why not do something a little bit fun? You're also interested in grizzly bears, apparently. Wrote an article up about that. So what can you tell us about grizzly bears on the railroad? I mean, I sort of understand the basic problem is that the railroads haul a lot of grain. BNSF specifically has a very large grain franchise. Those grain cars are loaded via gravity, so they're top loaded, and then they get discharged on the bottom. So if there's some leak, you can have grain on the railroad. I mean, I've seen it so bad that like the railroad track almost looks like a yellow brick road because so much corn has been left on the railroad. So it attracts wildlife. I mean, is that sort of the crux of the issue? They just need to clean that up.
Maybe. I mean, their recommendations, according to the suit that they filed in the U.S. District Court. So there are two environmental groups that sued BNSF over some deaths involving grizzly bears in 2023 and also throughout the last several years, and addressing the issue of preventing that spillage from grain cars was something that the groups had wanted according to what they said in their lawsuit. And that's actually, according to BNSF, that's actually one of the things that they're trying to address as well. Uh, I think, well, I guess two things. One is that um, the issue of grizzly bears getting onto track isn't necessarily just an issue of BNSF. It's something that uh, other railways happen to, even passenger rail have to go through. Um, uh, like for instance, in Canada, like CP Canadian Pacific at the time, worked with the Canadian government in addressing ways to prevent grizzly bears from getting onto track, and they had an initiative with like two California Canadian universities um, that from like 2010 and 2015, and even one of those universities is the University of Alberta is still kind of conducting research to this day on how um, to mitigate or prevent the deaths of grizzly bears on train tracks, and it refers they refer in their research, they refer actually to ongoing research in Sweden and and in Europe. So it's not necessarily an issue that's specific to BNSF. But what I think is interesting in this lawsuit is that they want BNSF to modify their operations, whether that's changing the schedules or slowing down, and then that's actually why the environmental groups filed the suit. They said, well, that it doesn't BNSF's plan to address this issue doesn't include those two possible um, possible actions. And there's also the question of uh, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services is supposed to approve BNSF's plan, and there hasn't been action on that either. So,
Mhm.
and yeah, so that's kind of where things are. And I'm not sure like what will the outcome will be, and what the purpose is, if it's to sort of, well, I mean, other than of course to get BNSF to do something, but like, but if it's also it's like to bring visibility into the issue, if BNSF can't adjust their operational schedules, which is whatever. um, what is that? Uh, what else can they do? Besides what they've mentioned already. So
Yeah, it doesn't seem like it was going to be too big of a deal ultimately, but kind of an interesting one to talk through.
mhm.
What was so you're working on some upcoming railroad articles. Some of these are going to be interviews with various players in the industry, and then your 2023 year in review article. Can you give us a sneak peek on what we should expect in those articles?
Yeah, so I think just thinking about it, I think the 2023 article and the 2024 article will be very much similar in terms of what themes happened in 2023 and what could happen in 2024. Um, the main difference is that the 2024 article will probably be long and will involve a lot of input from different people that I've talked to over the last several weeks. But I guess in terms of the, obviously rail safety is the big issue for 2023 and everything that kind of goes under it, which is the rail safety bill and just all the various other safety related initiatives, and then I think for 2024. What will be interesting is how the election, how the upcoming presidential election and it being election year, how that will affect things, and not just, well, I guess really in two key areas. One is the rail safety bill, of course. If it doesn't get moved in the first half of the year, what are its prospects of getting moved in the second half of the year when the election really, really comes into force? And and you might have legislators kind of being unwilling to take more action, especially when it gets close to down to the wire and like an election day. Um, but then you also have that question about how does the election, or does the election affect the Surface Transportation Board? Because it's not just finding an appointment to replace Marty Overman. It's also getting Patrick Fuchs reappointed too, because his term is also ending. And can you, how much, is it, will there be sort of an issue in trying to get him reappointed, or is that, could that be politicized somehow, or will it be kind of a non-issue and he'll be able to coast through? So, so I don't know. We'll see.
Yeah, so exciting stuff for sure, and those will be up on the site, later this week or next week.
Oh, I don't know. 2023 will be this week, and then 2024 could potentially be in early January, but I'm not sure.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, everyone, be sure to check those out, and hope everyone has a great day. Happy holidays.